In this video, I'm going to show you how to use various tools to create an isometric style grid. So the first thing that we really need is we need to set up our grid. Over in the tools, the line tool has a couple of different options to it. One of them is the rectangular grid tool. There's a polar grid tool, but for this point, we are going to use a rectangular grid. And when we click and drag, you can see that it makes a grid. And this can be very helpful because if you have snapping on, then automatically other shapes will want to snap to the intersections of the grid. We want a specific size of grid, so I'm going to delete that. And what we're going to do is we're going to just click somewhere on the desktop and let it generate one, and we can put in the exact numbers. My canvas that I'm working on is a 3x3 inch grid. So I think I want to make one larger so that once we warp it and shift it around, it'll be able to cover the entire area. So for this one, I need a 6-inch by 6-inch grid. And I want to change the number of dividers to it. So for this one, I'm going to go with 20 horizontal dividers and 20 vertical dividers. And that'll give us the various squares in our grid. And I'll press OK. We can see that this made a very large grid, which is helpful because we're going to use the move tool, line it up somewhere in the center, and we are going to move and alter it. The next step that we need to do to make this more of a kind of a background grid so that we can use it as a guideline is we need to make it a little bit less large and obnoxious. So I'm going to the stroke, and you can do it over in the appearances, or you can do it up in the top properties bar. I'm going to drop the stroke down to 1.25, just so it's a little bit smaller and not as large, so it's easier to know what I'm snapping to. And because I don't want it distracting too much, I think I'm going to drop down its opacity to somewhere between 20 to 30%. Let's go for an even 25. So we can see when I zoom out and when I kind of click off of it, it's very pale, which can be very helpful. So now what we need to do is we need to make this isometric style. So select the object using one of the selection tools, then come up to Object, Transform, and then Rotate. When we click on Rotate, it'll give us the angle that we need. Let's rotate this 45 degrees first. And so now it's 45 degrees, and we're almost there. It has that diagonal feel that we can start to use for our isometric, but it's still a little bit like a top-down view. So we're going to need to go to Object again and Transform again. And this time, what we're going to do is we're going to scale it. When we scale it, you can see that it has a either uniform scale, so I can make it all bigger or smaller, or I can do a non-uniform scale. And for this one, what we're going to do is we're going to squash it. So I'm going to squash it vertically a bit. Depending on what you need, you might want to play around with this. I found for this program and for our purposes, 59% works out quite well. So I'm going to press OK. And now we can see that we have this isometric grid style that works out pretty nicely. And we can see why I made it so big in the first place is so that it covers each of the corners. And I might need to move it a little bit so that it gets exactly where I need it to be and that there's no parts that are missing. But that is starting to look pretty good. So the very last couple steps that we're going to do is let's trim it down so that there's not so much excess on the outside of here. I'm going to come over to my shape tool and use my rectangle tool. And I'm going to make a rectangle that's the same size as the canvas. Then I'm going to use the selection tool, and I'm going to select both the canvas size rectangle and the grid. And then I'm going to right click, and I'm going to come down to make a clipping mask. And that will clip the grid to the square of the rectangle. And now it's a nice grid that I can use. Last thing that'll make your life a little bit easier is renaming your layer to grid or isometric grid or iso grid, whatever makes sense to you, and then locking it so that we can't alter it or move it accidentally. And then we'll just create new layers, and we'll either put the layers on top of or below, depending on how much you really need to look at the grid itself. And then you'll draw and make your shapes within that grid to create an isometric style. And so we can see now with this grid set up, if I use something like the pen tool, I'm going to change my properties a little bit so that it is easy for you guys to see. I can very easily see the intersections, and I can start to make isometric shapes very simply. And it wants to evenly line up to each of those different sections. So very simple and very easy. So go ahead, set up your grids, and start making some isometric shapes.